Every screen you have ever touched, every search you have ever made, every algorithm that has ever decided what you read, what you buy, what you believe. The architecture of the digital world you inhabit was not born in a Silicon Valley garage in the 1970s. It was not dreamed into existence by men in t-shirts drinking bad coffee in Palo Alto. The foundational concept, the idea that a machine could be programmed to process not just numbers, but any information expressible in symbols, including music, language, graphics, and logic, was articulated in full for the first time in 1843 in a manuscript written by a woman in a corset in Victorian England. 100 years before the first modern computer was built, the scientific establishment of her era ignored her. The historians who came after erased her. The computer science textbooks of the 20th century gave the credit to the man who built the machine she understood better than he did. Her name was Ada Lovelace, and what she wrote in those notes was the founding document of the information age. Welcome back to Medusa Awakened, where we unearth the voices they tried to bury. Augusta Ada Byron was born in 1815 with two inheritances that should have canceled each other out. Her father was Lord Byron, the most famous poet in England and one of the most scandalous men in Europe. A figure of such explosive romantic self-destruction that his name had become a synonym for dangerous genius. Her mother was Anne Isabella Milbank, a woman of rigorous mathematical education and considerable emotional coldness, who separated from Byron when Ada was 5 weeks old and spent the rest of her life conducting a systematic campaign to ensure her daughter would become nothing like him. Lady Byron was terrified of poetry. She was terrified, more precisely, of the particular kind of unhinged brilliance she associated with her former husband, a brilliance she believed was hereditary, contagious, and capable of destroying a life from the inside out. Her solution was mathematics. Ada was given lessons in arithmetic, geometry, and logic from the age of 4, not as enrichment but as prophylaxis. A bulwark against the madness she feared lived in the girl's blood. The tutors came in relentless succession. The schedules were punishing. When Ada showed signs of distraction or imagination, the lessons were intensified rather than eased. Lady Byron's reasoning was that the cold precision of numbers would crowd out the warm chaos of poetry before it could take root and flower into something unmanageable. What Lady Byron did not anticipate was that her daughter would refuse the entire premise of the opposition. Ada did not choose between her father's imagination and her mother's mathematics. She fused them into something neither parent could have predicted or controlled. She called what she was doing poetical science, the application of imaginative thinking to mathematical problems. The understanding that the most rigorous formal systems could be used to describe and manipulate the most beautiful and complex phenomena in the world. She was, by her early 20s, something that the Victorian intellectual world had no adequate category for. A woman who could do serious mathematics and who insisted on using it to think about things that mathematics had never been applied to before. In 1833, at the age of 17, Ada met Charles Babbage at a dinner party and saw the partial model of his difference engine for the first time. Babbage was one of the most brilliant and most frustrated men in England. An inventor and mathematician who had been trying for over a decade to build a mechanical computing device that could calculate mathematical tables automatically and eliminate the human errors that plagued the printed tables on which navigation, engineering, and science all depended. The British government had been funding the project for years and had almost nothing to show for it. Babbage was already designing something far more ambitious, which he called the Analytical Engine, a machine of staggering conceptual complexity that would not merely calculate but would follow conditional instructions, store numbers in memory, loop back through previous steps, and operate according to a program fed in on punched cards borrowed from the Jacquard loom. Most of the scientific establishment regarded Babbage as a brilliant eccentric whose ideas exceeded the manufacturing capacity of his era and the patience of the government that funded him. Ada Lovelace looked at the Analytical Engine and understood something that Babbage himself had not fully articulated. She understood what it was for. In 1842, an Italian mathematician named Luigi Menabrea published an account of Babbage's lectures on the Analytical Engine in French. Ada was asked to translate it into English. She did. And then she added her own notes. The notes were 3 times longer than the article they annotated. They are the most important footnotes in the history of science. In the section designated Note G, Ada designed a complete algorithm, a step-by-step computational procedure for calculating Bernoulli numbers using the Analytical Engine. It is, by the most precise technical definition available, the world's first computer program. The first algorithm specifically designed to be executed by a machine rather than performed by a human being. But the algorithm was not even the most important thing she did. The most important thing she did was understand what the machine fundamentally was. Babbage thought he was building an advanced calculator, a labor-saving device for the production of reliable numerical tables. Ada understood that any system capable of manipulating symbols according to rules could, in principle, manipulate any kind of information expressible symbolically, not just numbers. She wrote explicitly that the Analytical Engine could compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music, produce graphical output, and be applied to any domain of inquiry where relationships between objects could be formally expressed. She had invented, in her annotations to a translated article, the modern concept of general-purpose computing. She had described software a century before the word existed. She had articulated the theoretical basis for artificial intelligence. In a world that had no electrical power grid and no industrial precision sufficient to build what she was describing, she saw the whole of the digital future in a machine that had not yet been built. The British government did not fund the Analytical Engine. The scientific establishment did not rally behind the annotated translation. The paper was published in 1843 and received polite attention and no significant institutional response. Ada Lovelace returned to the life that Victorian society required of her. Wife to the Earl of Lovelace, mother of 3 children, hostess. A body subject to the opinions of male physicians who regarded intellectual overexertion as a medical risk to women of reproductive age. The tension between what her mind was and what her social position required her to be did not resolve. It intensified with every passing year. She became obsessed with applying her mathematical methods to horse racing, convinced that she could develop a system rigorous enough to produce consistent winnings that would fund her scientific work independently of either her husband or the patronage, structures that controlled access to serious scientific institutions. She was wrong. The gambling debts accumulated in ways that compounded and complicated. She pawned family jewels. She borrowed from people she should not have borrowed from. The story of her final years has been used repeatedly by biographers to imply intellectual instability. A suggestion that the gambling was evidence of the same recklessness that had destroyed her father, that Ada had been right all along to fear the Byron inheritance. This framing is dishonest. Ada Lovelace was not irrational. She was a woman of extraordinary intellectual ambition trapped in a social structure that provided no legitimate mechanism for that ambition to operate at the scale she required. The gambling was not madness. It was a desperate attempt to create the financial independence that the world she inhabited categorically refused to extend to her. If you believe history has been engineered to produce lone male gods while erasing the women who built the altars they stand on, subscribe to Medusa Awakened. Let us rewrite the narrative together. Ada Lovelace died in November 1852. She was 36 years old, exactly the same age as her father when he died. She had requested to be buried beside him, and she was at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, the poet and the mathematician placed in the earth side by side. The 2 halves of an inheritance she had spent her life refusing to separate into something lesser than their sum. What happened to her work after her death is the final act of the erasure. The annotated translation was not reprinted. It was not taught in scientific institutions. It was not cited. When the history of computing began to be written in the 20th century, in the decades when Turing and von Neumann and their contemporaries were building the actual machines that Ada had theorized a century earlier, the men who wrote that history gave the credit for the conceptual foundations of computing to the men who had done the building. Babbage was retrospectively crowned the father of computing. Ada was described in influential academic accounts as an enthusiastic assistant, a well-connected patron, a woman who had understood just enough of Babbage's ideas to document them with clarity, but who had not herself contributed anything that could be called original thinking. The notes were treated as transcription. The algorithm was treated as dictation. The vision of general-purpose symbolic computation was attributed to Babbage on the grounds that it was his machine she had been writing about. If the person who first understands what a tool can do is less significant than the person who built the tool without fully grasping its own potential. She had described the software and they gave the credit to the hardware. In 1980, the United States Department of Defense named a new programming language Ada in her honor. The recognition came 137 years after the notes were published, and after a century in which the history of computing had been written almost entirely without her name in the index. Every time a screen comes on, every time a program runs, every time a machine follows a sequence of conditional instructions to produce an output not physically predetermined by its mechanism, we are operating inside a conceptual architecture that a woman in Victorian England described before anyone else on Earth understood that it was even possible to describe. They tried to contain her mind within the decorative mathematics considered appropriate for women of her class and her era. She dreamed in code before the world knew what code was. The silicon and the software do not lie every time we power on. We are executing the legacy of the woman. The official history of science spent 100 years learning to forget and has spent the decades since then slowly, incompletely, belatedly learning to remember. Her name was Ada Lovelace. She wrote the first program for a machine that did not yet exist. They called her a translator. She was the source code.